the name of this webinar was quite changeable within the team here, trying to work out which area do we focus on the most. And we came to the conclusion that actually how progress is measured and data within systems is a really key area that links very well into the whole webinar series theme of systems coherence. So this webinar builds on our systems coherence discussion we held in webinar 1. In that session, we explore what it means for different parts of an education system to move in the same direction, both vertically and horizontally. Before I just remind everybody of that diagram, I forgot to sort of say at the beginning, I beg your pardon, we are going to record this. Please do use the chat, and there'll be a chance for Q&A at the end. Please keep your cameras off and the mic off, and we will share the recording at the end along with a series of briefs. So apologies for not starting with that. I wanted to dive straight in. So measuring progress in Inbuilt accountability and targeted delivery. As we had in our first webinar around systems coherence, Dan Wastel, our colleague, presented this idea that there's kind of a vertical integration and a horizontal integration. And coherence is ultimately about supporting better learning, and that happens through what it means for different parts of an education system to move in the same direction. So this webinar emphasizes that evidence only drives improvement when it's connected through closed loops, from diagnosis to action, feedback and accountability, and when it's designed with the realities of the system actors in mind. So today we're focusing on a really critical part of that coherent story, and that is about data and evidence. So not data just as numbers or as dashboards or mail requirements, but data as part of the architecture of a system, both vertically and horizontally. Data as something that should genuinely support people at every level of the system to make better decisions, from central ministries to districts and inspectors, all the way to schools and classrooms. And over the years, many of us here have experienced how complex this can be. We know that pressures that programs face in meeting zoning requirements. We know how log frames evolve, sometimes dramatically, and how those shifts can create real tension between what a program needs to report and what a system actually needs to function well. And we also know that many of the data flows inside systems have long histories, their own political dynamics and their own embedded routines. So these are very real challenges that we grapple with. So one of our aims today is to take a step back and ask, how do we make data and evidence serve the system rather than the other way around? And we're going to have a look at this and how it's played out across different programs, including where we've seen alignment work well, where it hasn't. We're going to reflect on the shift we're seeing in the sector with fewer large-scale programs and more interest in lighter embedded system-first models. And we will explore how data and evidence can be used more effectively to support decision-making, accountability, and delivery within education systems. I think there's, while there's widespread agreement across the development sector on the importance of evidence for informing what works, this webinar moves sort of beyond that sort of technical debates around indicators and tools to focus on how evidence is embedded and data is embedded within systems of governance and delivery. And we're going to draw on lessons from Cambridge Education's work across diverse country contexts. And the webinar will address the technical and operational kind of tensions and issues that arise when designing and implementing data and evidence systems. And we're going to reflect on the approaches that have supported progress, identify critical success factors, and revisit those challenges that persist, including where approaches have been less effective. And a central theme throughout all of this is the question of who collects, who analyzes and uses that data, and how operational arrangements can be integrated into program design so that evidence meaningfully informs implementation, learning, and accountability at these multiple levels of the system in the diagram we see here. And also, really importantly, and perhaps most importantly, we're going to be thinking about the future. So what, if anything, needs to change in how we design programs, in how donors set expectations, and in how systems organize their own data ecosystems to create coherence between learning aims, system needs, and the evidence that flows through them. And we have a great set of speakers to help us do that today. You'll be hearing from Charlie, who's our team leader in Malawi, having previously worked on Cecil in Uganda. We have Stuart Johnson here with us, who's worked on Shulibora, Malawi Maths, Cecil, LIFT. He's our MEL specialist that's worked across many of our programs. And then Sabine as our principal education advisor, who's worked very closely with Gates and has managed many UNICEF programs And we're talking specifically around Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. I would also like to introduce Karen Austrian as our chair, who will say a few words in a moment. So Karen leads the Population Council's Girl Innovation Research and Learning Centre, which is a global research hub that generates, synthesizes, and translates evidence on adolescents to support investments that transform their lives, especially for girls. She's no stranger to evidence generation and has led large longitudinal randomized trials evaluating the impact of multisectoral programs for adolescent girls. But moreover, she's passionate about using data and evidence to guide resources to where and for whom they are needed most. So welcome, Karen, and over to you.
Thanks, Emma, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm humbled to be amongst, colleagues on the panel who have really been living and breathing, it sounds like, data and evidence to improve education systems. So as mentioned, I lead the Girls Center at Population Council, where we try to match sort of both generation of evidence together with use of data and evidence, and really sort of hold strongly to that ethos that data for data's sake is not only is it sort of not helpful, but I would even go further to say that it's actually harmful because you're spending resources collecting it without actually using it. So how do we think about, just some high level thoughts to frame thinking about data and evidence before the really experienced panelists really dive into how it's been happening in practice in the education sector. So sort of two sort of frames for thinking about data and evidence as a critical tool. We can think about it from an accountability perspective. So holding duty bearers accountable, making sure that promises have actually been kept. And, when we think about sort of just in language, when we use the phrase sort of, it doesn't count, that doesn't count, you don't count, it is almost things that are in, it's a negative value connotation. And essentially what you're saying is that if you don't count, you don't matter. And so I think that by documenting, by providing data, by counting, it is in essence sort of an accountability to say this matters, and we care enough to spend resources on this because we will then use it to improve what we're doing. I think often also budget allocations end up becoming political. And if we do a good enough job of sort of grounding our work and sort of value priorities in data and in evidence, sometimes if done well, that can help to guard a bit against shifting of allocation, shifting and allocating resources towards sort of where the data shows it's needed most, where the data shows that it is most effective, and away from political. And so when questions and statements come up, the data can often serve as a little bit of a neutralizer under that accountability frame. I think another frame to think about data and evidence also in sort of how can the investment in this really be useful is from a targeting frame. And so, I mean, I'm probably speaking to the choir a little bit, but in most countries, national data statistics really mask subnational variation. So for example, in Kenya, where I live, you have multiple counties where less than 1% of 10 to 14-year-olds are out of school, right? So near universal enrollment, but we also have a number of counties where over 1/3 of 10 to 14-year-olds are out of school. So using data and evidence for targeting is really critical. Again, like there are counties where the gender gap in enrollment favors boys, and there are counties where the gender gap favors girls. And I think that, so using data and evidence as a tool for targeting, which ultimately, I think, is a tool for efficiency, because as education systems improve, the gaps, the weaknesses, whether it's in enrollment or learning outcomes or in quality, will be more concentrated in hotspots. And so the ability for systems to be able to identify using data and evidence those hotspots, I think ultimately will make programs more cost effective. And I think given the changing in the funding landscape, this is only going to be more important. I think it will be critical going forward, as I mentioned, not a shock to anybody, but with shrinking resources, there's going to be this issue of divergent priorities. And I think really pushing against moving data and evidence from a need to have, we need to push against it going out of the need to have bucket into a nice to have bucket. And again, in terms of really with the funding crunches, a shift to really relying on sort of internal and national funding mechanisms within countries and less of a reliance on ODA, having those investments in data and evidence systems is even more important to make sure that the funds that there are really going both to where it's needed most and to what's working. Just a few sort of final musings. One, I think, is thinking about the role of data and evidence systems in the education sector. It's true also of the health sector, but as DHS data likely will become obsolete over the next couple of years, as sort of the investments in it will no longer happen. And so the latest data sets will become too old on which to use to make any kind of projections or targeting of investments. It's really these national data systems, whether they be census, health, education data, that will be needed and relied on to really look at sort of where the weak spots are, where the positive trends have been, where the negative trends have been. So thinking about shifting what are sort of core data sources for decision making become. And then sort of one final musing, and this is, my work has really been education is a piece of it, but it's really thinking about adolescents and children as a whole, and the range of issues that they face. And one of the challenges in working vis-a-vis adolescents is this really siloing of thematic areas. So you have the health sector, you have the education sector, you have the social protection sector, and on, and all of them touch adolescents. And this is an issue broadly for coordination and implementation of evidence-based programming, but it also translates into data. And I think just challenging ourselves as a community, can we envision a world in which strengthening data systems is not only sector specific, but also sort of cross-cutting, so allows us to see sort of the full picture of how we might integrate the way in which we work with children and adolescents, no matter what sector they show up in. So a bit of a challenge and a thought to ponder as we dive more deep. So I will turn it back over to the panel. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for raising, I know, a couple of points that we are going to be talking around in a moment with some examples. I think there's that danger of using those averages, as you refer to that, is really, really critical. And also thinking about that intersection with sort of national data sets and what that means for programming. And I know that our examples are going to speak more to that sort of system-wide element around that. Just before I pose some questions, I was reflecting on Cambridge Education over 45 years. I've not worked for Cambridge Education for 45 years, only the last 6. But if I think about the data and evidence landscape within the older arena, of which Cambridge Education has played a big part in that, I think there are some ideas that we will situate this webinar against that backdrop of that broader landscape shifts. And just very quickly, I think there are sort of 5 that I think speak to what we are going to talk about today. Firstly, we've seen a real kind of clear shift away from standalone program-centric MEL systems towards approaches that are more explicitly system embedded. We know that evidence systems are expected to meet kind of donor reporting requirements, compliance requirements, but also to align with government priorities, capacities, and decision-making processes. I think there are some trade-offs there that we will bring up in some of our examples today when we're designing sophisticated kind of program-level systems and ensuring that data and tools remain accessible and usable and sustainable within those government systems. I think secondly, that landscape has also moved from an emphasis on data production, and I think Karen alluded to that at the beginning here, to a stronger focus on data use in those accountability loops. I think we need a kind of clearer attention to feedback mechanisms, learning processes, and accountability arrangements that are connecting that evidence with that delivery and then the performance sector improvements. I think this webinar highlights the growing recognition that the middle tier is often playing a critical role in making those loops function in practice. The third thing is that, as we know, there are constrained financing and increasing scrutiny of results. And I guess this is more a reflection of the question: is this driving more efficiency, prioritization, and coherence? We would hope so. But I think with fewer resources available, there's greater pressure to reduce that duplication, streamline those data systems, and a focus on evidence that genuinely supports the strengthening rather than parallel support reporting structures. Then I think, fourthly, there's an emerging shift on how success is understood. It's no longer the case that it's just sort of short, medium-term outputs and compliance, but we're now moving towards sustained system capability beyond the life of programs. Here, having discussions around Shulibora, it's like, what happens post Shulibora with those data systems? So that includes a greater emphasis on attention to roles, behaviors, and incentives around that particular evidence in terms of who owns it, who trusts it, who acts on it, and how. And this webinar reflects a change by foregrounding not just tools and frameworks, but also those kind of operational and political dimensions of evidence-informed delivery. And lastly, and I know Karen and I have spoken about this in the past, I think there's a recognition that data and evidence alone are not enough to drive system-wide improvement. While strong data and evidence exist in a number of areas, their uptake remains uneven and concentrated. And evidence is most likely to influence outcomes in its simplest form that speaks to kind of government priorities, it's government owned, and it's embedded within those decision-making processes and supporting accountability processes rather than being treated as a standalone technical exercise, which a lot of programs, including some of ours, have done parts of in the past. The programs at Cambridge Education have worked increasingly on institutionalizing how evidence is understood, discussed, and acted upon within that system. And really, the last thing I'm going to say is when we were thinking about the kinds of work we've done in this area, in data systems, we were putting our work into three sort of buckets, really. And we're thinking around, and the programs we're going to hear about today fall into one of these three. They're not mutually exclusive. You can see on the screen, it's possible to have two of these in one program. But I think we have ones where we have a discrete component around improving access to and the use of data by the system. And the middle tier we talk about there, that would be Cecil, LIFT in Rwanda, Sierra Leone. Many programs in the past have done that. And then we have slightly fewer programs that have focused on technical assistance kind of contracts, where the objective itself is to support the MEL function or the equivalent of that within a monitoring evaluation of aspects of the education system and within the government itself. And then lastly, a lot of the larger scale programs you have, we've seen, especially when they've been longer, there's been a real shift in how we are viewing data systems and how we leverage our role as implementers in doing that, but adhering to the kind of the MEL requirements we have. But that more and more is about improving access to and the use of data by the system itself and using existing systems and mechanisms that already exist. So I'm going to pause there, and then I want to hand over to the panel. And the first question we have, and I'll direct that towards you, Charlie, is how have you worked to strengthen access to and usage of data for improving education outcomes? And perhaps what are some of the key design principles in making this work?
Right, thank you, Emma. Greetings, everyone. Hope this finds you all very well. I speak to you from Lilongwe. So to the question, just as background, Cambridge Education's system strengthening, system supporting approach to all its large programs has naturally led to kind of recognizing the importance of the sub-national system levels, what is now commonly termed as the middle tier, which is often the part of the education system which has the greatest potential to support schools, adapt innovations, and ultimately improve performance. And I think this is particularly the case in the decentralized education systems, which applies to the context of Malawi and Uganda, which are the two examples I'm going to be speaking about now. And as part of these efforts to strengthen system coherence, the two programs supported the governments to increase the availability and usage of data and evidence to provide targeted support to schools. So as mentioned, I'm currently the team leader for the National Mathematics Curriculum Reform Programme in Malawi, which was launched in 2020. And I previously worked as a technical team leader in Uganda for about 2018 to 2023 on the Strengthening Education Systems for Improved Learning. That's the CESL program. I know there's a lot of acronyms we're mentioning here, but that's the CESL program. And both of these were funded by FCDA. So in terms of the kind of key design considerations across the two programs, and they both had a primary focus on raising learning outcomes. And firstly, it's about agreeing on the priorities to track, to build that clarity and help reduce the noise for system actors. So the issue isn't usually about the amount of data available. Education systems produce plenty of it. In district offices, there's often folders full of reports and data tables, but the challenge is whether any of it is helpful to inform what should be done in key areas, particularly around the critical question of, are children learning or likely to be learning anything in schools? So the first step in supporting the Ugandan and Malawian governments was getting a consensus on which small number of issues really matter and should be the clear priority for decision makers to focus on across the system. The principle being monitoring approaches gain far greater traction when they reinforce the existing national priorities for improvement. So in Uganda, through a series of design consultations, both at the national level and the district level, which included supporting district education actors to conduct diagnostic activities across the sample schools, 5 issues were identified which were impacting learning outcomes, which were children not coming to school, teachers not coming to school, children not feeling safe in and around school, teachers not sufficiently engaging children in learning activities when they are in school, and school leaders not effectively focusing their work on learning. And I think those priorities are quite revealing, but I might come back to that later if there's a chance. So in Uganda, the adoption of a nationally agreed set of indicators meant that the program's monitoring system was welcomed as a strengthening tool rather than a competing system. In Malawi, as guided by the Ministry and the Directorate of Quality Assurance, in particular, the key areas that were prioritized were similarly focused around attendance as well as the activities of the primary education advisors or the payers. And so these are the system actors tasked with supporting schools and teachers, and the fidelity and quality of implementation of the foundational maths curriculum reforms. Secondly, having agreed on the priorities, the task is about what data on those is meaningful and usable at every level of the system. And as Karen was saying, the usability here is key. For example, EMIS data exists in both Uganda and Malawi, but by the time it is published in the 3rd term of the academic year, here in Malawi, for example, based on data collected in the 1st term of the year, it's too late to be useful to respond to any immediate issues on the ground that schools might be facing. So the focus has been on supporting governments to have as immediate as possible feedback loops through the data so that they can target and take actions and see if that needle has moved on a priority. For example, whether learner attendance has improved from one month to the next. And as such, the data needs to be accessible and useful at every level of the system, from the school or zonal level to the middle tier as well as the national level. And I think this differs from more conventional delivery lab approaches, which tend to primarily focus on data usage at the central ministry level. And there is that slide there, if you're able to show that. This is what we call the 5D framework. We found 5 words that begin with D, this kind of essentially shows that routine management cycles at every level that integrate data as the instigator for discussions and actions. So in Uganda, the discussion and decisions elements took place during monthly pre-established routines, and key findings from the data were looked at and discussed. Decisions on what needed following up on, doing differently, or adding in, and this was then fed back into the delivery process. Also important was strengthening this connection and communication between different parts of the systems. So issues could be escalated, for example, replacing a teacher who's stopped coming to work, or further interrogations and follow-ups on specific cases pursued. And similarly in Malawi, where it also had a focus on implementation of the maths curriculum, the data helps with various school level actions, and this includes where to focus support. So thinking about issues such as which schools need prioritizing, which schools are underperforming, how can we move towards a more targeted approach to allocating the limited support resources we have available, and also where to learn from. So which schools are overachieving and why, and could they be used to support their peers? And then finally, a key underlying design principle is ensuring it's system generated and system led and not parallel to it. So this means being sensitive to the existing ways of working and avoiding creating additional roles and responsibilities to under-resourced, overstretched system actors. In Malawi, the primary education advisors, the payers, often have little support or accountability for their performance, have access to almost no CPD opportunities, and have limited means to reach schools because they don't have a working motorbike, or if they do, there's not enough fuel to run them. So the approach needs to build with these limitations factored in, and any program specific tasks such as observing early grade maths lessons are built around supporting them to do their core role better. And I think the tools are also a key consideration. The fidelity of implementation tools were co-designed with government and aligned with the national education standards, which is the reference point for the payers. And it also captured data points which the payers are expected to routinely monitor as well. And in both countries, data submission also relied on devices that the data submitters, so the head teachers in Uganda and payers in Malawi, already had. In Malawi, even though as a program there's no mobile data provided to the payers to submit online every month, this hasn't proven to be a sustainability issue, with submissions routinely generating insights on 2/3 of all the primary schools in the country on a monthly basis. Let me stop there, Emma, and hand back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. We've got some questions coming in the chat. What I'll do is have a look at that. I'll go over to Stuart now with the same question, because it'll be from a different perspective. So Stuart, from your perspective, how have the Cambridge Education programs and yourself worked to strengthen the access to and usage of data for improving those education outcomes? And are there key design principles in making this work kind of across those programs or within them?
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and greetings, everyone. Yeah, so a very interesting set of questions and points already been made, some of which I'm going to pick up on, maybe enlarge upon. And I suppose what I want to say from the start is that, Charlie's been speaking as a kind of a team leader perspective. I speak very much as a MEL specialist, which kind of has its own kind of particular perspectives, and maybe some of that will come out in what I said. So, yeah, I've been working in MEL for 20 years now, and I've seen some of the changes which Emma alluded to at the start. The last 6 years, like Emma, I've been working for Cambridge Education, And what I would say is that it's been an enormous privilege, actually, that the type of work that Cambridge Education has done over those years has really afforded the opportunity to work very closely with governments in a way that I hadn't done in my previous work, for working for an NGO and so on. So it's been a real privilege. And I think that we're able to speak now and really draw some lessons on this question of how have we gone about strengthening access to and usage of data for the benefit of the system, as well as for programs as well. So just want to mention some of the examples that I can speak to where I've worked. So one would be our work in Sierra Leone, which is a program where we've supported the secondary education system there. And at the top, Emma, you mentioned there's been broadly 3 types of work that we've done, one of which was where there's a discrete objective set by, in that case, FCDO for strengthening kind of the data part of and use of evidence part of the system. And that work in Sierra Leone would be an example of that, where one of the output areas for the program was about strengthening the school quality assurance department and their work, and really strengthening that link between the officers being based at district level and the support for schools. So there, a tool was co-developed with them that they could use as a consistent way of collecting data from schools. Also work around your targets for how many schools on a monthly basis they should be visiting, and providing resources to enable them to collect data. In that particular case, the data is collected using a Tangerine platform. So some of these very practical considerations need to be thought about as well. And that data is then being put into dashboards, which is feeding decision makers and decision-making routines at national and district level, talking to the kind of middle tier element, which has been mentioned already a couple of times. So that would be in Sierra Leone. We've also done a lot of work in Tanzania, where Emma is at the moment, and the Shula Bora program. I was part of that from the start up to around a year ago. And you know, there's multiple examples there. And I guess what I would say is that that program had both elements of some aspect of saying, yes, we as a deliberate part of the program, we want to strengthen the use of data and evidence, but also maybe speaking to the perspective as a male professional, is that there are actually opportunities that go beyond when your donor sets an objective to strengthen that there are opportunities, and maybe if there are male professionals like myself on the call, this is a challenge for you, is to always look out for opportunities for where there are obligations for collecting data that you need for a log frame indicator for reporting to the donor, or equally for supporting learning and project adaptations, working with technical colleagues in your team. There's a lot of requirement and expectation to collect data, and that there are choices about how you go about that. And I think this is one thing that I'd want to be sharing, is that wherever possible, if you can use that stimulus to collect data as an opportunity to strengthen the system at the same time, you know, it's a win-win and important for efficiency as well. So we have examples there where, in a sense, a log frame was driving it, or a log frame indicator was driving it, or the need to provide technical data. I'll give an example where we had a lot of investment around teacher professional development. And so we needed to know what was going on in classrooms. And so the question was, well, how can we collect that data? What kind of tool can we use? And so we could have set up a system where we were sending in enumerators or kind of program staff to be collecting that data. But we thought that for the sake of the system, it'd be much better for them and ultimately for us and the legacy of the program to work with the agency that has that remit right now. And so we worked with the School Quality Assurance Agency and co-developed with them a tool that was largely based on the World Bank Teach tool, but was aligned to their own framework. So it was collecting data that was meaningful to them and would be meaningful even outside of the remit of Shula Bora as a program, but would also supply what we needed as a program. So we designed a tool, trained them how to collect that data, and they were collecting that data. And more recently, we've trained also ward education officers who are also government officers operating at that sub-national level to collect that data. And there are other tools that we've developed similarly like that, where we needed the data for log frame purposes and for learning and project adaptation purposes, but also we've put in place tools and systems for collecting that data on a routine basis, using government staff and putting the data in their hands and analyzing it, putting back in for their use as well as for the projects. Charlie is currently in Lilongwe in Malawi, and he and I have worked together on over the last 18 months as well on another piece of work there, which has really been at its heart about strengthening the government's own systems for data collection whilst delivering against a program objective. So we have again designed a tool, co-developed it with the ministry there, using quite simple tools really, and simple tools both in terms of data collection but also in terms of presentation of the data at the end, is making that data available in an accessible way that's really going to be targeted, like Charlie said, in terms of not having too many indicators, but the right indicators, which are really going to be levers for change. And I could speak all about, maybe we'll come to this later on, around the practicalities around how you actually set these things up. And also importantly, this is something we've done in a couple of projects now, is when the systems often have to be set up initially with a large degree of investment of project staff and maybe even using project systems. But we've worked to transition those systems across to the government. And so how you go about that, there's a lot of learning that we could say around that, and also challenges. And then maybe one more example to a current example where I'm working in Rwanda with colleagues. And right now, something we've been doing over the last few months is again working with those sub-national level government officers whose remit it is to support schools, where again they didn't have that consistent tool for collecting data. And so we've worked with them to come up with a data collection tool which works for both them and for the program, and again creating these routines of data collection, data processing, analysis, data visualizations for supporting decision making in that kind of middle tier level. So maybe some of the key principles I just want to extract is one is the importance, the essentialness of working collaboratively with the government and with the right parts of the government, finding that those opportunities for crossover which serve both program requirements and needs, but also the needs of the government and the parts of the government that are involved in that part of the system. And working with government staff, those people who are already at that level, whose remit it is to go and support schools, to visit schools, they're often doing that job already of going to schools, but often, and this is our experience, they don't have consistent or robust data collection tools. So actually it's a real benefit for them of us using our expertise to work with them to develop those tools. But using those government staff is the forerunner of working at scale, and that's always something that we're mindful of. How can we push something which is going to be able to go to scale? And using the regular routines, collecting data on a regular basis, sometimes setting those routines up, something that Charlie was talking about with the 5 Ds, the kind of the regularity of those things. And I guess that's one thing I'd say is the government systems that we know about, they're often not short of data, but maybe they haven't got the right kind of data, and also the real-time nature of the data. How often is that data coming in? A lot of the data systems that we see in EMIS systems are coming on an annual basis or less often, but often that's not frequent enough to provide the real levers for making the kind of change which middle tiers can really speak to. And maybe the very last thing I'd say is that the data that you get in, which the kind of needs that we have, it comes from the school level, can be used to serve the different needs and perspectives at different levels of the system. To talk back to the kind of vertical coherence, the same data can be used to kind of really inform school level but also district level decision and also national level decisions. So kind of using the data in a very efficient and effective way to kind of be presented in a way which is most meaningful to the agents and the decision makers at those different levels is another design principle. I think I'll leave it there, Emma. Back to you.
No, thanks, Stuart. I think maybe the audience, but myself also would have an awful lot of questions around perhaps some of the challenges you faced doing what you so eloquently described. It's not as easy as that, is it? It's I think Sabine, it'd be great to hear from you because I know you have another perspective on strengthening access to and usage of data with the work that you've done in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. Over to you, please. Around what are your sort of key design principles in making this work or how that's happened? Sabine, you're on mute.
Better? Hello?
Absolutely. I can hear you now.
Okay, very good. Sorry, I said hello everybody and thank you for giving me the floor. Yeah, a slightly different perspective, but very similar in terms of the key principles, key design principles and challenges that both Charlie and Stuart mentioned. So as Emma said in the beginning, for the last 2 years or 1.5 years, we have been working with the Gates Foundation to support ministries of education in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire on monitoring, evaluation, and learning as these two countries scale their national early grade reading or early grade learning programs or reforms. Senegal is scaling a national language-based bilingual reform for the early grades, which is called MOHEBS, and Cote d'Ivoire is scaling a national reform for early grade learning, which is called PNAPAS. And the Gates Foundation is bringing very targeted support as the ministries in these both countries are setting up MEL frameworks to accompany the scaling of these reforms. And we heard Ben Piper say in our first webinar last year that the aim is here again to align the system around learning, to make data available that allows data-driven decision-making for improved teaching and learning, and ultimately improved learning outcomes. So in both countries, the support goes directly to the ministries of education. The MEL framework is set up by the ministries and implemented by system actors only. And we are supporting with light and lean technical assistance. So as we were asked about key design principles, I wanted to give one example on how Cote d'Ivoire has managed the setup of their MEL system and especially the prioritizing of indicators. Stuart mentioned the log frames that we have in our large-scale TA programs. Here in Cote d'Ivoire, it was the ministry who decided to start off developing their MEL plan for the National Reform Program by establishing a theory of change. The Ministry of Education in Cote d'Ivoire, and that's an interesting feature, they have established an EdLab, an education evidence lab within the ministry with support from the Jacobs Foundation. So this EdLab brings together colleagues from the main ministry directorates that are involved in the education reform. So the planners, the basic education specialists, the pedagogues, and the EdLab leads on evidence-based decision-making. So we have worked with this EdLab to develop the MEL plan for PNAPAS, for their reform, based on a theory of change and a results framework. So the theory of change was to show the changes that the ministry wanted to see, thanks to this FLN reform. And for the results framework, the EdLab then looked at indicators that were already measured by the education system, some indicators that previous donor-funded programs had set up, and we had really very interesting discussions on the data that was needed to track changes that this reform was about to bring up. Discussions around what data is already collected, if there is data that is collected but not used, Is all the data that they collect really needed? Is all the data used, and what for? For instance, there was a lot of data collected on the number of classroom visits, but then the discussion went, is this actually enough? What about the quality of these visits? What do we want to know about how inspectors and pedagogical counselors do when they are in classrooms? Do they know what to observe? Do they know what good looks like? Do they have the right tools and capacity to give relevant feedback to teachers? So what is the quality of their coaching work? Are the classroom observation tools that were in place covering the right practices that teachers should put in place to allow children to learn under this reform program? So these were really interesting discussions, and then the results framework that the AdLab came up with decided also on how data was to be collected, who would collect it, and when. All these routines that Charlie and Stuart mentioned as well. In both countries, Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, the ministries decided to focus on intermediate factors and not only on learning outcomes for their MEL work. There is in both countries definitely a focus on classroom observation data to get better insights on how teachers manage the teaching practices that are promoted by these foundational literacy and numeracy reform programs. In both countries, we have worked with the ministry actors on their classroom observation tools to focus them even more on the teaching practices that were seen as the most relevant, and allow the pedagogical advisors and inspectors to focus their attention when they visit classrooms and coach the teachers. In Senegal, the ministry decided to harmonize various classroom observation tools that had been put in place previously by different donor-funded initiatives. Now they have one single tool that is used under this MOHEBS reform, and that is used by all the inspectors on all the elements of classroom practice. As in Côte d'Ivoire, these tools do not only cover the specific teaching practices for reading or mathematics, they also look at classroom management, they look at time on task. As Charlie said, they look at attendance of teachers and students. In Senegal, there is a special attention on the use of national languages, obviously, because their reform is based on national languages being used in the first grades. And so the ability of the teachers to teach in these national languages was chosen as one important indicator for this classroom observation tool. As I said earlier, in both countries, system actors or government structures have full ownership of the tools and the processes. Both ministries decided to set up digitalized platforms, especially for classroom data, to facilitate data collection, and obviously even the more so facilitate data analysis and data use, especially at the middle tier and in the decentralized education offices or inspectorates. And as I said earlier, their MEL systems do not only cover classroom observation data, but also attendance data, information on teaching and learning material, whether they are available, relevant, and used. They cover formative assessment data, which is collected quite a lot in the system, but was not enough used so far. Yeah, maybe so far as for this first question. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks to the three of you for walking us through some of those kind of key design principles. I'm looking at the time, and I know that we have 36 minutes left, and I want to give time for kind of Q&A. I'm wondering if perhaps we can combine sort of the question 2 with question 3 in the sense that we know there are challenges, and you've alluded to some of those around kind of what data is meaningful and usable, the kind of the variety of different tools in the system. I think also with some of those system actors, perhaps some of the pressures and the capacities that they already have. I know sometimes it can be overloaded. So thinking about some of those key challenges and obstacles, but link those to question 3. So in the sense of what are those kind of key lessons and takeaways that really have resonance for the future? Because I think a lot of what we're talking about has changed over time, and it's part of business usual of programming. But if I may remind you of the retraction or the decrease in funding, our ability to be able to have some of these program systems and these larger scale programs, that's changing. Of the challenges you've had and those obstacles, please allude to what you have faced, but then also think about what some of those key lessons for the future. Is it possible to marry those two? I'm going to come to Stuart first. I'm around that, if that's okay with you. What would you take forward, given the kind of current climate we have?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, it's hard to know precisely what the future holds. I guess we all have some indications of what it's like, but I think what is clear, and I think Karen mentioned this at the start, is the word efficiency. I wrote that down. We really need to be aware of limited resources and really making that count. And I think just generally as a principle, maybe it's no surprise for me as a male professional to say this, but I do think that using data for making differences at the coalface, at the school level for children is a very effective lever that we have and that governments have. And so fundamentally, I think it is an efficient approach to make the most of existing resources and everything we've been saying around setting up mechanisms and cycles for using that data, not just collecting the data, but using the data is essential. But I mean, I do want to mention, I guess if I was asked, what are the key challenges? I mean, there's many things I could say, but one thing that has been very apparent to me, working with government counterparts, very kind of grounded, practical set of challenges is they are very constrained individuals and departments. Individually and as a team, they're very constrained on time. People we're working with, IT officers, MS team members, school quality assurance officers, the different levels, different types of people we interact with, they are being pulled in many, many different directions. And that is just a reality of working with these teams and seeking to build their capacity and setting things up. They maybe don't have quite the same luxury to focus. I mean, I know we're also very busy, but they are being, it seems, pulled in many, many different directions, and time is a massive constraint for them, and resources as well. I've actually been quite shocked. I've seen worked with IT departments where the IT officers are having to purchase their own IT equipment because the government doesn't have the budget to buy their own hardware. These are very resource constrained departments, and we need to be cognizant of that. And instructions to, wherever possible, use freeware software rather than costed software. I think that there are kind of false economies with doing that, and security risks with doing that, and so on. But that is often the context that they're working with. And the other thing I would say is I've worked with some absolutely brilliant individuals, very capable, could definitely get work, in different parts of the economy. But you also work with people who, frankly, you think, well, you're working in IT, but do you really have the fundamental IT skills? And so that is another real challenge when working with these people, is if you're trying to build their capacity, you find some people who take to things very, very quickly and others who you really struggle with. And I guess, so thinking to the future then, I mean, one thing I would say is a real lesson from our work is you can never start too early in terms of thinking about, if you are working with a program and trying to build these systems, build the capacity, set up those systems, and looking for ownership, is design those things from as early as possible, because our experience has shown, often to our pain, that it takes a long time to set these things up, a long time to build the capacity and the ownership, setting up the routines and the systems, and really to start to see that flow resulting in changes. So you can never start too early. I think that's one thing. But in terms of efficiency, you know, if we're going to have the likes of these programs that I've been privileged to work on, where, you know, there are objectives around accountability to donors and so on, and I said this earlier, is seeking out those opportunities for overlap, and don't only think in terms of program mail requirements, but see them as opportunities to strengthen the system and the kind of creating that legacy for the system in terms of data and use of that data. I think proportionality is hugely important as well. Yes, in terms of making sure we're looking at the data which is needed, which is something that Sabine just mentioned. But sometimes there is such a thing as good enough data. It doesn't have to be the most complex, the most perfect data. And also the presentation of that data. We need to think about the audiences, you know, how data literate are they? Can we convey things in really simple but effective ways? And I think the last point I'd leave it on is we've talked about this issue of looking beyond the averages. And I think there's been a number of studies which have really revealed that when we present things in terms of averages or percentages, yes, it helps us to really understand the noise that's in data. And it really does help us to see trends and so on, but it also masks a lot as well. And we know that there are many children, many schools, many parts of the system, many districts that are really lagging behind those averages. And so those averages, those percentages can really hide things. So again, when you're setting things up, when you're creating dashboards or reports, presentations of the data, yes, present averages, but also support that targeting, which Karen talked about at the start, by really drawing attention to those districts and those schools which really need that additional support.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks very much for that response. I think you speak a little bit to the question in the chat around from Hanan about managing to get data. I'm going to come over to Charlie this because I know in Malawi that you worked very hard and very long within the system itself with that data collection. So what are some of the key challenges and obstacles you've faced? But think about it again, the same question I posed to Stuart, more future facing. What are those sort of takeaways that you see perhaps being sustained in Malawi in those programs and settled? What are your thoughts on that, please?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Everett. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain, you know, well, not so surprising, you know, in terms of the messaging that I would share with Stuart as well. But I think the major challenge that, you know, I've experienced in both Uganda and Malawi is this, you know, when we're looking at that data cycle, is the usage part of it and translating it into impactful actions. You know, and I think there's some overlapping factors that feed into it, and because of time, I won't go into all of them. But you know, Stuart talking about, you know, his reflection of not being able to build too early. I think that is, you know, a critical kind of message here is the time needed to embed the routines, you know, to focus on improvement. You know, what we've seen in both Uganda and Malawi is a big emphasis on getting the data submissions going. You know, we've lots of energy put into working with those primary education advisors and payers to submit data, or supporting head teachers to understand, you know, the submission requirements. And the submission rates have been impressive. You know, in Uganda, we routinely had 9 out of 10 schools submitting data. And, you know, in Malawi, just last month, we had data on over 4,000 schools. We have around 3/4 of all primary schools in the country. But as we keep saying, you know, the key is to move from proving to improving. And if these routines, you know, don't lead to better support to schools, that ultimately results in improvements on the priority areas, then it's, you know, just become another data generation exercise that fails to benefit the learners in schools. And so we've seen some fantastic green shoots where, you know, mid-level actors have taken actions based on the data to target specific teacher needs, you know, such as holding zonal level trainings, bringing in local expertise to address, you know, issues that they're seeing in the classrooms and so on. but creating a culture of using data to inform decision making takes time and patience. And kind of feeding into that, one of the other key challenges is of data literacy, and how data is valued in the system. Data has not historically been used in a systemic sense for decision making in these contexts, particularly at the middle tier and actors working close to schools. So without this culture of data use in their daily work, the demand for it, at least to inform actions, doesn't always exist. So I think we need to recognize the differences in evidence more broadly speaks to people, and how persuasive it can be or not to drive decision making. A nice digital dashboard might be appealing to me, but it's easy to overlook the different ways in which people are able to engage with that data, to trust that data, and most importantly, take meaningful, and sometimes politically difficult actions as a result of it. I've often found that kind of qualitative anecdotal evidence often speaks much more to people. Thinking of a meeting I had with a director last year where we looked at a dashboard of the availability of workbooks from data across thousands of schools across the country, and overall it was looking pretty good. Schools weren't reporting major shortfalls, but shortly after, in the same meeting, an officer shared her experience of how she had visited a school, and there weren't enough workbooks, and this prompted a grilling from the director about, well, what is being done about all the book shortages in schools. So we had this conversation about, well, undoubtedly, there will be schools that need support, but what about that data we've just been looking at? Things are going broadly well now. So I think the point of data is to help make better informed decision, but I think there needs to be more exploration on not only how you build data literacy within systems, but also kind of what kind of data is actually going to speak to people, whether this is, or how you bring in kind of qualitative, participatory, or perhaps, kind of research designs that maybe value stories and, indigenous ways of knowing, perhaps. Maybe one kind of final reflection, and coming back to the point about time, and pulling back further in terms of the kind of international evidence on what works, particularly around learning outcomes. When I'm looking for international evidence to be inspired by, to inform the work I do or the advice I might give governments if they're looking for it, I'm usually guided by a few basic questions on the initiative or reform I'm looking at, which is, does it work? For example, what's the robust data on impact to learning or key behavior changes? And the next question would be, how far has it been scaled? There are a million good ideas out there that can demonstrate impact in 10 to 20 schools, and that's easy to do, but what about all the schools in an education system? And thirdly, related to this is, at what cost? For example, per child, does any impact require an army of program staff parallel to the system providing weeks of training, coaching, and expensive materials to ensure the impact, or is it at the cost that is somehow absorbable into ministry budgets? And I'm glad that we're finally getting more demand for an analysis on the latter, but it does feel to me there's still a dearth of evidence and a lack of transparency on cost effectiveness. For example, how much it costs per child to raise learning outcomes. The final question that I spend more and more time looking for now, though, is and how long did those gains last for? And that evidence is even harder to find and interrogate, which I think is a real concern and telling in its absence. What limited evidence is out there will tell you that even for those interventions that are lauded as highly impactful, those impacts start to flatline or tail off quite quickly. And at Cambridge Education, we've independently tried to do longitudinal studies of our work, for example, from Gansu in China, but donor funding hasn't historically allowed for this. And I think this kind of papers over the deeper, more important factor of system coherence and how that will ultimately determine whether investments in fairly immediate learning gains can be sustained and are owned. So I think, yeah, just on a bit of a segue, I mean, perhaps as the dust settles on this era of donor support, with a drive to support Ministry of Education in specific approaches, it's a great moment to invest in generating evidence that takes stock of how far those initiatives left, lasting change. And taking it one step further, perhaps this is a call for, braver, longer term system focused investment, because my sense is that if that's where you invest, that's where you'll see deep improvements that stick. Over.
Thank you, Charlie. I certainly would like to have a bigger discussion on that. I know that was a big question on, for example, on the Girls' Education Challenge that was 12 years long. There were lots of reasons why there wasn't as much of that as perhaps was desired initially, but there were those longitudinal studies. Sabine, over to you for the last sort of the mashup of question 2 and 3 together. I'm really interested on where Charlie sort of finished on this sort of a future facing, the things that we've learned around that, given the current climate of reduced funding and perhaps increased efficiency drives, etc. So over to you, Sabine, please.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And yeah, and I'll bring it back to this capacity issue again. I think that both Stuart and also Charlie mentioned, because I think this is where the teams in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire are right now. So they have their MEL plan, they have the theories of change and the results frameworks. In both countries, we also supported the ministries to set up data management routines, like the ones that Charlie shared, the 5 Ds, especially at the decentralized levels. But as Stuart said, these teams have many conflicting tasks. So even with a protocol that says how to collect data, when to upload data on the digital platforms, and performance contracts in place to say how many classroom visits a counselor should do, how many classroom visits a school director should do, a routine in place on how to analyze data. In the end, it comes down to these counselors and planners and inspectors at the deconcentrated level to do it. And I think we have to be really very conscious that there is a lot of pressure on these actors, on the counselors, school directors, inspectors, planners, pedagogical counselors and inspectors need support to use the digital platform. The planners need to make time to access the data and analyze it. And maybe as a future positive or very, very optimistic sign, what we have seen in Senegal, both in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, is that there is also now a lot more collaboration between these different actors. And I think this is something that can definitely bring a lot for these routines. Collaboration both at the central level, and here I'm talking about the directorate in the central ministry that manages the digital platform, working together with the planners at the central level and the pedagogues in the directorate for basic education. And they have worked all together to set these routines up. And the same as at the deconcentrated level. We have been sitting with education planners who had never been sitting with an inspector looking at data, although they are sharing the same building. And they are very very happy now to engage in this and come with their expertise, their data expertise, and make data visible, so that planners, so that pedagogical counselors and inspectors can use this data and report on it and learn from it and set teacher coaching up in a better way, and are able to identify, as Karen said in the beginning, identify these hotspots where to concentrate on. So that is, yeah, it's both a challenge, but it's also an optimistic way into the future. So better collaboration at the various levels, and better working together to make these routines a day-to-day data management routine and help improve the system.
Thank you very
Thank
much, Sabine. I know we only have 15 minutes left, and there are 3 questions in the chat that I'd like to come to, and then I'd like Karen to close in the last 5 minutes. So I think Hanan posted a question. I think it was for you, Charlie, because it was right at the beginning. Have you seen it in the chat, or shall I read it out? Or Hanan, you can please unmute if you'd like to.
Oh, thank you so much. So I'm working with various groups like World Bank, etc., and in a particular country, and we're really finding it very difficult to get data. So my question to you is very basic. How did you manage to get data, and what data source did you have faith in its validity and comprehensiveness?
Yeah, I mean, so I think all the examples that the examples I was speaking to were essentially about improving the generation of that data. So of course, as mentioned, there is a lot of kind of system generated data, but the reason why that kind of pre-existed, but the reason why we were brought in to provide that technical support to the government was to try and make that more coherent, make that speaking to the key areas that want to be tracked and so forth. But I do think the question around validity and so on is and comprehensiveness. I mean, is something that is a key one here, and I think it points to what are the incentives around concerning the people who submit that data, who use that data, and so forth, because all of our data was based on self-reported data. So it's in the programs that I work with, so head teachers were submitting data about their own schools, to payers submitting data about the zones that they are overseeing and so forth. And of course, if there are, we know so often that if there are incentives attached to that data being higher than in reality, then that's going to be taken, and we see that with kind of school feeding, in terms of grants and so forth. So I think it's really supporting the system to ensure that the usage part of that data is done very sensitively. It's not about seeing bad data or data on low performance and using it as a stick necessarily to hit those schools with, but about how genuinely can those schools be supported. How can the system better understand what's going on in those schools, for example, and also having kind of system-led kind of verification exercises as well. I think is another part of the validity of that data that we're looking at. Emma, did you want to come in?
No, I was just I'm looking at the clock. No, but I don't want to interrupt you.
Let me stop there. Yeah, let me stop.
Okay, no, Thank you for that. In the chat, if you have a question you'd like to explore more, please drop your email and we can connect you with people. That's not a problem at all. There was another question that came in, and I thought, Sabine, this was more geared to some of the work and the experience that you've had, and it's by Thomas. Did you want to unmute, Thomas?
Hi. Yeah. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for those discussions. Yeah. I'm wondering. So there's this need that we see in many of these countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I've been confronted to this lack of data availability. And I was wondering, so if we want to contribute to fill in this gap and helping to set up the systems. So I hear that the Cambridge Institute has been working on this. The Jacob Foundation has been collaborating with the government. How can other institutions get in touch with the government? How can we engage with them? So is it just about networking, or is it like more official paths where there's call for these kind of opportunities, or how do this happen actually? And how can some other people also follow the same idea and engage with the government?
Sabine, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Thomas. No, I think, yeah, quite a few of these contracts are open bidding contracts. So the case Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, in Senegal, as I said, the platform has really been set up by the ministry themselves. So they have a department that is specializing in technology, and they have had a platform, and they have added this classroom observation management tool to their platform. But I know in Côte d'Ivoire, it was through a World Bank funded call for proposals that then a company came in to support setting up for the very technical pieces of it. Yeah, definitely through calls for tenders and. Yeah, I don't know how you manage this in Stuart in Malawi or in Senegal for the very technical pieces of this support. This is what you were alluding to, right, Thomas?
Yeah, so just both, right? So like setting up the system, or also like keeping it alive and making it useful, adjusting the tools. I mean, yeah, all the different parts. To be honest, I haven't found those calls, but so I was wondering if there was other means through which one could access these opportunities. Yeah.
Stuart, are you going to come in, or would you like me to?
No, you go ahead, Emma.
So I think I'm just looking at the time again. Thomas, it is a really interesting question. I think one part of that is about other people accessing it. But if I think about some of the programs we've had more recently, is really engaging with the current data systems and using those, not bringing another one in, as all the panelists have kind of alluded to. And I think part of that is also then the relational aspect of the work that exists on some of these larger scale programs. I know that's a really unsatisfactory answer, perhaps, but there are those sort of networks and organizations within that that are kind of contributing that data, but it's pushing those doors open. And I think on some of our larger scale programs, we have been fortunate to be able to do that. And it kind of links to one of I know in the chat, sorry, I didn't get the name wrong. Something's gone wrong with my Teams. There was a question around the Gangstu project. That was a long time ago. Oh, Jingzhou, sorry. And there was loads of data there. Part of that, though, and I'm going to answer this question at the same time, is around their interest in it, but also who owns it. And that's a really big part of this. So if I relate it to the GEC as well, there was a whole ton of data, but ultimately that was kind of owned by the donor. And in some cases, there are sort of it's owned by government. But I think it's about going back to the kind of the donor who's funding that program and looking at those sort of the ownership of that also. I know we're nearly out of time. I'm going to pause here. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. And over to you, Karen, just to finalise this webinar. And I'm sorry there wasn't more time for questions.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to all. This has been a really interesting and really rich discussion. It's hard, I've been sort of listening keenly and reflecting on where we are at the moment in our sector. And so maybe I'll just, I leave with a couple of points that really resonated with me. So one is that there was a lot of conversation around data collection, data usability, and I think at its core, it is, I believe, an imperative to think about collecting data that is answering questions that data users are asking. So, and it's a shift away, and especially going forward, away from sort of what do we as, education professionals, Mel experts, what do we think is important? Increasingly moving away from what sort of donors think is important, but really saying the people we want to use this data, what are the questions that they're asking? Because I think ultimately, not only is that going to guide what data is then collected, but also how you collect it, how you package it, how you share it. So really starting with the grounding of sort of that, the people who we want to be using the data, and starting from there. And I think that is really critical for feeding this, somebody used the phrase, sort of creating a culture of using data. So if we start with the data users at its core, is one thing. The second, and again, sort of really grounded in this context of shifting ODA, a sort of really lower likelihood that there's going to be these large scale donor funded programs going forward, the importance of integrated systems and being efficient, not being duplicative. And again, it links back to this, who are the data users? They're already engaged by government, and where are they in the system, and what are the data systems that they're using, and at principle integrating in. And I think that leaves us with some really hard questions around trade-offs. And I imagine over the course of this webinar series, you'll be exploring this, and can't think of a better organization than Cambridge Education to really, give insights into how we grapple with some of these questions around trade-offs in this moment in our sector. How do we trade off having all of the, data what we want versus what is going to be used? How do we think about integration and scalability vis-a-vis often, systems aren't necessarily designed to reach those that are most marginalized and most left behind. Those are difficult trade-offs, and I think that in this moment in our sector, we don't have the luxury to sort of work on both, but we're going to have to think about that. And so I think it's a great group to be grappling with these questions. And yeah, thanks for a great conversation. Really interesting. Back over to you, Emma.
Well, everybody, thank you very much for your time. We do have 4 more of the webinars. I know that the invitation or the flyers are circulated on LinkedIn. Please do reach out if you want to talk to anybody or have things you'd like to share. And as always, it's great to have an opportunity to discuss some of the nutty issues that face us virtually. So thank you very much indeed. Have the rest of the day. I hope it goes well. And see you next time. We do have our next one tomorrow at the same time on violence, reducing violence in schools. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Karen for the chair, and see you all soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah.